Okay, so let's go ahead and begin talking about European battles of World War II. Essentially, the United States strategy going into World War II was to throw offensively most everything we had at the European theater. And once we had defeated the Nazis, go and then take those resources and then defeat the Japanese, which meant that in the Pacific theater, while we were throwing everything we had at the European theater, the Pacific theater, Americans were going to be in kind of a defensive position. They'd be sort of trying to hold the line as much as possible against the Japanese until we could defeat the Nazis in Europe and then take our resources down to the Pacific. So that was the basic strategy going into World War II. And of course, on the left, we've got Hitler. On the right, we've got Stalin, the communist dictator of the Soviet Union, and probably one of the top 2 or 3, if not the number 1 most evil person to live in the 20th century, Joseph Stalin. And of course, the dictator of Nazi Germany, who, as you guys know, was pretty evil himself, Adolf Hitler. All right, so as you all know, World War II, of course, began when the Nazis invaded Poland on September the 1st, 1939, and World War II would last until September of 1945. Battles were fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Germany was very successful at the beginning of World War II. We talked about that strategy, the Blitzkrieg. Blitz means lightning, okay, in German. Krieg means war, lightning war, fast. Hit the enemy fast, quickly, hard. Throw everything you've got at them as quickly as you possibly can. That was the Nazi strategy. It worked very well in Poland. It worked very well in France once France fell. And Hitler thought that he would be able to use the same strategy against the Soviet Union, which is not going to be as successful, thankfully, as you guys are going to see. So, Adolf Hitler, by late 1942, which was the darkest point for the Allies in World War II, the Nazis had conquered the overwhelming majority of Western Europe. Late 1942 was probably, as I mentioned, the darkest time for the Allies. The Nazis were doing very, very well in the war. Frighteningly well. The real fear was that if England fell, all of her allies would basically be gone in Western Europe, and that would have been a complete disaster. After conquering most of Europe, including France, Hitler looked to conquer Great Britain. Great Britain was the last major European country left to fight Germany. Once Hitler defeated Great Britain, he could turn his attention to the Soviet Union. Hitler and Napoleon have so much in common in terms of strategies. Both Napoleon and Hitler believed they could successfully cross the English Channel and defeat the English. Okay? Thankfully, both of those men were going to be very wrong. All right? What Hitler decides to do once he has conquered France is sort of soften up England for a land invasion. Now, how's he going to do that? Hitler's going to use the German Luftwaffe, or Air Force. And so in what becomes known as the Blitz, German planes bomb English cities, principally by night. Has anybody ever seen Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Has anybody ever seen that movie? Okay, the very beginning of the movie begins with a Nazi pilot bombing London. That's the reason why the children were sent away into the countryside to live with that doctor, with that professor to begin with, is because they were trying to get the children out of the cities and into the countryside so they wouldn't get killed from the falling bombs, Nazi bombs during the Blitz. Okay? So Hitler decides to soften up England by bombing them, sort of soften them up before he decides to launch a land invasion. All right? So Hitler's plan was that once he defeated Great Britain, he could turn his attention to the Soviet Union. But yeah, Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler had agreed not to fight, and Stalin had agreed not to fight with one another. But of course, we can't trust Hitler. He's already lied at Munich whenever he invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, and he is certainly going to lie to Stalin. So Great Britain is an island separated from the mainland Europe by the English Channel. It doesn't look really that far away, but the logistics of trying to launch a mainland invasion of the British Isles is very difficult. There's only been one person in human history to actually cross the English Channel and conquer all of Great Britain. Does anybody know who it was? Wasn't Julius Caesar. He only took over about half of it. Ever heard of William the Conqueror? Okay. 1066 AD, the Battle of Hastings. He's the only man to ever successfully conquer all of England. Okay. Napoleon tried it, failed. Hitler is going to try it and mercifully failed. Okay. So Hitler's plan was to use airstrikes to take out Britain's Royal Air Force, also known as the RAF. Without air support, Britain's Navy could be easily defeated. So the battle for Britain began on July the 10th, 1940. First, Germany's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, under Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, attacked Royal Air Force bases. Next, on September the 7th, the Luftwaffe began bombing large cities like London. And that's where the order was given to send children out into the countryside. By this point in time, the great Winston Churchill is Prime Minister of England. Okay? And he is going to be a symbol and a rallying point for the British people. You are asking me, who is the single most important individual, male or female, of the 20th century? I would say Winston Churchill. Because that man is going to literally will the Allies to victory in World War II. Kind of the George Washington of the Allied cause in World War II, of course. During the battle for Britain, many civilians were killed and towns completely devastated. Even though Great Britain suffered great damage to Royal Air Force bases and towns, the British did not give up and actually started using radar to detect incoming Luftwaffe. For 57 nights in a row, the Luftwaffe bombed London. Hitler would continue bombing London at night until May of 1941. Hitler still bombed London at times, but he needed his Luftwaffe to attack the Soviet Union instead. So the Royal Air Force, very heroically, very courageously, is going to hold off Hitler's invasion. The Royal Air Force is going to prevent the Nazi invasion of Great Britain. Okay? And it's at this point where Hitler's going to do the exact same thing that Napoleon did. When Napoleon failed to soften up England enough to be able to invade them, he turned his attention to Russia. So guess what Hitler's going to do whenever he fails to take England? He's going to turn his attention to the now Soviet Union. Russia. He's going to try to do the exact same thing. He's not giving up on it, understand. He's just kind of like, well, we'll put England up on a shelf and save it for later. We'll come back to that at a later time. You know, they're softened up, but we've got them right where we want them. But let's go take over the Soviet Union first, and then we'll come back once we've done that and finish the British off. So very heroically, the Royal Air Force prevents the Nazi mainland invasion of the British Isles. All right. The single most important battle in the European theater was this one, Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a city on the Volga River, deep inside the Soviet Union. It was a major industrial city, but more importantly, it was named after the dictator of the Soviet Union himself, Stalin. What would that symbolize if the Nazis were able to successfully capture and hold the city of Stalingrad? Huh? It would mean a lot because it's named after the dictator of the Soviet Union, right? So it was symbolically would be like the war's over. They captured the city named after the dictator, right? So if the Nazis were able to successfully capture and hold Stalingrad, it would be a sort of a symbolic victory for the Nazis. So by this point in 1942, the Nazis have just been, when they do invade the Soviet Union, and what becomes known as Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, guys, they had been invading for days, like hundreds of miles deep inside the Soviet Union, until Stalin, he had no clue. And when he was told that the Germans were invading, he's like, there's no way. The Nazis, like Hitler would not be that stupid. You know, why would he do that? And when the realization set in that Hitler had lied and had violated the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, Stalin became very depressed because he knew what it was going to take to defeat the Nazis. And he knew that the Allies probably were not going to, the rest of the Allies were probably not going to help him. Okay? So the Eastern Front becomes one of the most horrible killing fields of all of World War II. A trip to the Eastern Front was pretty much a death sentence. Okay? So as the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, they murdered people, shot people, killed people, raped people, did all kinds of terrible things before the Soviets really even realized what was going on. Once the Nazis reached Stalingrad, they were able to take the city, but they were quickly surrounded by the Red Army, by the Soviet Army. And the city itself was just completely leveled. It was completely destroyed. But the Germans that were inside it got cut off from supplies. The only way they were able to get supplies was by the Luftwaffe. The Red Army surrounded the Nazis. And it was basically, we're going to make them use up their ammo. Essentially by offering human sacrifices as bullet catchers. So what the Red Army would do is they would forcibly put soldiers in boxcars and take them to the Eastern Front. And they would literally march them by like literally guns at their backs into the city of Stalingrad. And they would say, all right, one man would get a rifle, the guy behind him would get 5 bullets. And there would literally be people around there saying, when the guy with the rifle gets killed, the person behind him picks up the rifle and shoots. So it's like they're offering human sacrifices to catch the Nazi bullets so they can run out of ammo, so they can be defeated. Stalin had so little regard for human life. He was so evil. He said, I want that city recaptured at any cost. And Hitler said, I want that city held at any cost. So 1.2 million people died. Guys, that's 12 Neyland stadiums full of soldiers that die at Stalingrad in one battle. Okay? That's a lot of people. All right? So Stalin gave the order that any retreat, that anybody who retreated or appeared to be retreating be shot. So the Soviet officers were instructed to shoot their own men if they thought that they were being cowardly. Okay, and that happened quite a bit. I'm going to show you a scene from a movie, the beginning of a movie called Enemy at the Gates, about the Battle of Stalingrad here in just a few minutes. But this was absolutely hell on earth. Okay. In order to even get to the city, you had to cross the Volga River. And in so doing, Nazi Luftwaffe Messerschmitts would come and try to shoot your boat up, and try to drop bombs on your boat before you could even get to the city to fight. It was important Germany because from there they'd be able to easily launch attacks on the rest of the Soviet Union and gave a psychological blow to the Soviets because the city was named after the Soviet dictator Stalin. It was important to the Soviet Union because it was a major industrial and communication city, and certainly because it bore Stalin's name. The battle began on July the 17th, 1942. German troops would reach the city on September the 3rd. The Luftwaffe bombed the city before ground troops moved in, and by late September, Germany had reached the city center. So they actually did take the city for a while. Stalin ordered that it be retaken. Here was the problem. The Nazis had absolutely no idea. They thought this was going to be a quick battle. They thought that it was going to be over quickly. They could have never dreamed that the Soviet winter would ultimately be their biggest enemy, as it was Napoleon. It wasn't an army that defeated Napoleon in Russia. It was the Russian winter. And that's actually what's going to happen to the Nazis while they are in Stalingrad, is the Russian winter is going to set in and become their biggest enemy. Well, historically, one of the things that the Russians have always done throughout history, they will actually let you invade their country. They'll actually be like, come on in. Russia is such a massive, massive country. It's hard to really describe. It's so large. They'll actually let you invade. And in so doing, they'll destroy everything. As they withdraw, they'll destroy everything, burn everything, and make you extend your supply line. And then once they've gotten you far enough in, they will surround you. And they will cut off your lines of supply. And then they'll slowly move in and cut you to pieces. Okay? This is what happened to Napoleon's army. Napoleon actually took over Moscow. He actually took the city of Moscow. But the Russians had destroyed everything, so he had nothing to feed his army with, and ended up having to retreat and leave the city. And it was on his way back to France that they got picked to pieces by the Russian army. Okay. So in Stalingrad, Germany occupied 90% of the city. The swastika flag right here flies from a Soviet building. German soldiers continue to overtake the city here. However, the Soviets wouldn't give up. Soviet troops hid in buildings, rubble, sewers. They attacked German troops relentlessly and just kept throwing bodies, just kept throwing men at the Nazis. Again, as bullet catchers, like we're going to make you use up all your bullets and all your ammo by offering these human sacrifices in the name of Mother Russia. By mid-November, German troops were beginning to run low on ammunition and food. The Soviets surrounded the German troops and cut off supplies. The Germans suffered in the harsh Soviet winter. The remaining 91,000 Germans surrendered on February the 2nd, 1943. The result of the Battle of Stalingrad was severe humiliation for Hitler. It was a huge confidence boost for Stalin. The German army suffered terrible losses and would never fully recover. I like to compare Stalingrad in World War II to the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War. Would the Confederacy live to fight another day after Gettysburg? Yes, but they were never the same. Would the Germans live to fight another day after Stalingrad? Yes, but they were never the same. What happens is that instead of being on the offense now, instead of pushing deeper into the heart of the Soviet Union, the Nazis are now backing up. Now they're on the defense, losing territory, and the Russians start to move in from the east. Okay? So the Soviets would soon push Germany out of the Soviet Union. And boy, are they mad. Boy, are they ready to exact revenge on the Germans for invading their nation and doing terrible things. The Soviets have big plans to do the exact same thing to the German people. Everybody with me here? Good? So this is the most significant battle of World War II in the European theater. The turning point of World War II. The Nazis are forced to go on the defense after they lose the Battle of Stalingrad, and the city is retaken by the Red Army. Everybody still with me? We good? Awesome. Okay. The single most important date in the history of Western civilization, June the 6th, 1944. Okay? In my opinion, the single most important date in the history of Western civilization. Even after losing the Battle of Britain and Stalingrad, Hitler still controlled most of Europe. The Allied powers needed to get a foothold in mainland Europe to push Germany back. American and British troops began launching airstrikes in German-held territories to slow down German troops. Among those were my grandfather. My grandfather was a tail gunner in a B-17 during World War II and flew 29 missions over occupied Europe from that time. They would take off from an air base in England, and they would fly over parts of occupied France, parts of Germany, and just bomb them back to the Stone Age. Okay? The average number of flights that one would fly in a B-17 before they got shot down was 7. That was the average. My grandfather flew 29. He bombed Berlin twice. He bombed Munich twice. He was all over the place. Bremen, he hit them hard. Shot down. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for shooting down 2 Messerschmitts in World War II. And he said he saw the guy bail out, both those guys. When he shot the plane down, he said he saw both the men bail out and their parachutes open. He said, that made me feel really good. He said, my job was to bring the plane down, but he said, I never had to live with the fact that I'd killed a man. So he said he was very thankful for that. He said that guy, was serving his country just like I was serving mine. And he said, my job was to bring the plane down, and that was what I did. So he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service in World War II, and I'm very proud of it. Okay? So, as I mentioned, the most significant day in European history was, in the history of Western civilization, June the 6th, 1944. This is known as D-Day. Okay? Also known as the day of the attack or Operation Overlord. All right? Germany knew that the Allied powers were planning a big invasion, but they didn't exactly know where it was going to come. Most Germans believed it was going to be General George S. Patton that would lead the invasion, and that it was probably going to come in southern Europe somewhere. All right? Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of Allied forces in World War II, planned an invasion of France in a place called Normandy. All right? The Allies made it look like they were going to invade north of Normandy at a place called Pas de Calais. In the first wave of the attack, paratroopers parachuted behind German lines at night. They secured bridges and exit roads. Dummies were dropped out of planes to trick the Germans into thinking that indeed the invasion was coming at Pas de Calais. So why was D-Day so terribly important? Why was this such a big deal? I'm going to draw a really terrible illustration here. It's been a while since I've drawn for you, but I'm going to try. Okay. Why D-Day is so important? Well, here's France and here's England. All right? Now, what the Allies are going to try to do at Normandy is establish what is known as a beachhead. All right? Up until this point, when we did attack Nazi-occupied Europe, we were having to fly from England and bomb them and then fly back to England. What we do on June the 6th, 1944 is at great cost, at many human lives. Ever seen Saving Private Ryan? Great movie. At a great cost of many American lives and British lives, we established a beachhead in northern France. And from that beachhead, once we take over that small amount of land, we're able to start sending tanks, and we're able to start sending jeeps and men deeper into occupied France. So we are able to start launching land attacks as well as air attacks. Does that make sense? We're able to close in on the Germans from the west, while Stalin's Red Army closes in on the Germans from the east. Does that make sense? Single most important day. Hitler actually slept through it. He was told he didn't want to be disturbed. He thought the attack was coming elsewhere. So, while the D-Day attack was going down, Hitler slept through the whole thing. He said he didn't want to be disturbed. Okay? In the second wave of the attack on D-Day, warships bombed the beaches from the sea, Allied planes bombed German defenses, and French resistance members cut telephone lines and destroyed bridges to begin slowing German troops. So we're hitting them on land? Yes, sweetheart. Of course you can.
Do me a big favor. On your way back, could you swing by the pizza land over here and grab me a Diet Dr. Pepper out of there? To the little refrigerator.
So attacking them simultaneously by land, by sea, by air, giving the Germans a taste of their own medicine here. The French resistance were those people inside France that worked to hurt the German war effort when they were occupying France. Everybody with me here? Are we good? Yes? Wonderful. All right. The Battle of Normandy on D-Day included over 5,000 ships, 150,000 troops, and over 11,000 aircraft, and included troops from the United States, Great Britain, and even Canada. Now, some of the beaches that the troops landed on encountered no resistance at all. Were taken, like literally, just walked right up onto the beach. Nobody shooting at them, nobody even there. But boy, other beaches really got big-time resistance. Americans really caught the full brunt of the Nazi military machine, and many Americans were killed trying to establish that beachhead from which we could launch attacks on the Nazis. Okay? The British took Gold Beach and Sword Beach, and they encountered very little resistance at Gold and Juno. But the Americans, oh boy, Omaha Beach was the bloodiest. That was the worst. Americans encountered the heaviest resistance at Omaha Beach as what was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. So Americans really paid a high price for that beachhead that they were able to successfully establish mercifully. And so the liberation of France had begun once we were able to take over that beachhead. You guys still with me? Are we good? Good. Are we good? Everybody still with me here? Excellent. By June the 17th, over 500,000 Allied soldiers were pushing the Germans out of France. Guys, this was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The Allies threw everything they absolutely had at the Nazis on the beaches of Normandy and were able to establish a beachhead from which they could start launching ground attacks against the Germans. It was a success, but at great human cost. All right. By the end of August 1944, northern France had been liberated. American troops marching in Paris after France was liberated right here were very welcomed by the French population. French tanks and troops marching in Paris here after France was liberated. Germany now had to fight on its west, and Germany now had to fight on its east. Think of it as a noose beginning to tighten around the neck of the Nazis. The Americans coming, invading from the west, the British and the Americans, and the Soviets coming in on the east. So slowly but surely, the Nazis are being pushed back on both sides, just like World War I, guys. Remember that? Germany's greatest weakness in World War I is they had to fight a two-front war. Well, guess what Hitler has now gotten them into? Right? The Germans are now having to once again fight a two-front war on the Eastern Front against the Red Army and the Western Front against the Americans and the British. And mercifully, the Allies are going to win. The last big Nazi offensive was called the Battle of the Bulge, and it came in December of 1944. Hitler's chance to force the Allies off mainland Europe is considered one of the greatest battles fought by the U.S. military. Germany used a blitzkrieg to attack Allied troops in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. So this is kind of like, this is it. The Germans are throwing everything they have left at the Allies in the West. They're trying to punch a hole in the Allied line, okay, and cause the Allies to collapse. They're trying to drive us off, okay? So they're trying to punch a hole in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. The Germans know this is pretty much it. This has to succeed for the Nazis, otherwise the war is going to be over, and they know it. Good? Germany attacked the center of the Allied front line, and in so doing, the Allied front line got pushed back, which created a bulge in the American line. Hence, the Battle of the Bulge. Okay? Over 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks would break through. The Allies were caught off guard and thousands of Americans were killed, but that's not all. English-speaking German spies got dropped behind the Allied front line. These German spies were dressed in American uniforms and told lies to try and confuse the Allied troops. Things didn't look good for the Allies, but the Allies refused to give up. Allied troops destroyed German fuel reserves, so Germans began to run out of fuel for their tanks. The Battle of the Bulge lasted for about a month, and included about 100,000 American casualties. Okay. The Americans did not surrender. We did not give up, did not give in. It really did catch the Americans by surprise. A lot of people did not believe the Germans had that much left to throw against us. But boy, they did. They weren't going to go down without a fight. But we stuck to our guns and did not let them get the best of us. Slowly but surely, the Americans began to counter the attack. Everybody still with me here? Good? Okay. Allied troops fought until reinforcements came. Whenever the commanding officer of the American forces was offered an ultimatum by the Germans, was told to surrender, he responded with one word: nuts. N-U-T-S, nuts. And the Germans must have thought, what in the world? But they were going to hold out until American reinforcements arrived, and arrived they did. Hitler's last chance at pushing the Allies off mainland Europe thankfully and mercifully failed, but at great cost. 100,000 American casualties. That's a Neyland Stadium full of people either hurt or killed. Casualty means injured in battle, wounded in battle, or killed. Yes? Yep. The Battle of the Bulge was an Allied victory. The Battle of Berlin was the last major battle fought in Europe. It was primarily between German and Soviet troops. Soviet troops greatly outnumbered the Germans. The battle for Berlin began in April of 1945. Stalin basically told the Red Army they could do whatever they wanted. A blank check to commit atrocities against Germans. Use your imagination, folks. Robbing, raping, pillaging. The Soviets were given a blank check to do whatever they wanted to the German people. The battle for Berlin. I mean, this is it. This is the lion's den. This is the very end, and the Germans know it. Berlin becomes a frontline city. Okay? The Soviet Union sent 2.5 million soldiers into the battle for Berlin, and boy, are they mad. They had 7,500 aircraft and 6,200 tanks that they threw against the Germans in the battle for Berlin. Germany was down to around 1 million soldiers in Berlin, 2,200 aircraft, and about 1,500 tanks. German soldiers were starving, sick, and wounded from years of fighting. The Soviets were able to attack the city and easily surround it. Now, Americans basically said, Dwight Eisenhower basically told Stalin, yeah, I mean, nobody suffered like the Russians had in World War II, so you all can have the honor of taking the city. And that, of course, saved American lives. Many American lives would have been lost as soon as he gets back. Many American lives would have been lost had the Americans tried to invade the city of Berlin. So we basically told the Russians, yeah, you guys can have it. You guys can have it. So like a noose, the Russians surrounded the city and started closing in on the city. By this point in time, Hitler and what was left of the Nazi government had gone beneath the Reich Chancellery, which was the Nazi government building, deep under the ground into what was called the Fuhrer bunker. Okay, and inside the Fuhrer bunker, there were offices, there were bedrooms, there were communication stations and telephones, and big air vents pumping air down into the bunker. And this is where Hitler and Eva Braun, who was his secretary but girlfriend, and the Goebbels family, the minister of propaganda, and his family, and many other high-ranking officers hid up until the last moment when the Russians did surround them. So on April 20th, which was Hitler's birthday, the Soviets began bombing the city. So a birthday present for the Fuhrer. They don't think that the Russians didn't know that, so they began bombing the crap out of Berlin on Hitler's birthday as a birthday present, so to speak. Hitler knew that Berlin was going to fall. So he called in additional German troops from the west. He also activated the Volkssturm, which was an army of old men, like little old men that were in the city of Berlin were activated, became known as the Volkssturm, and died needlessly. You know, it's like just more bullet catchers. If you were to talk to the Red Army and you were to ask them who are they most afraid of in the battle for Berlin, it was the children. The Hitler Youth had been so indoctrinated into being willing to give their life for their Fuhrer. The Russians said, you didn't have to be afraid of the German soldiers because they were smart enough to know it was over and they were hiding. The kids were the ones you had to watch out for. The kids would just come running out, fanatical, crazed, with potato mashers, which were grenades, tackle you and just blow themselves up and you too. And these little children would just come running out and throw these potato mashers at the big Soviet tanks as they rolled it. They were the ones, because they had no fear. I mean, they were literally fearless. Those were the ones you had to watch out for. When you saw a Nazi kid, one of these Hitler Youth come running out, that was when you were terrified because they did not care. They had been indoctrinated to lay their life down for their Fuhrer and were prepared to do it. In fact, the last time on his birthday, the last video footage of Hitler is him coming out of the Fuhrer bunker while literally the Berlin is in rubble behind him and putting medals on children, Hitler Youth, for destroying tanks and shooting soldiers. That's the last video footage there is of Hitler, was him decorating Hitler Youth for destroying Russian tanks and things. Okay? So here's the Reichstag. The Fuhrer bunker was below the Reichstag. You can see how Berlin is just completely in rubble here. And what ended up happening was that Hitler was told that they were literally just hours away. Like it would just be a matter of hours before the Russians were in the Fuhrer bunker. So as a reward for Eva Braun sticking by him, he married her. And after they were married, they went into Hitler's parlor, and Hitler had a cyanide capsule. And he gave Eva Braun one, and he took one. And to make sure they got the job done, they both bit down on the cyanide capsule. And he shot Eva Braun, and then he bit down on the cyanide capsule and shot himself. Well, then the bodyguard, his personal adjutant, carried him and Eva Braun, their bodies, up into the courtyard, and a big pit was dug. And they tried to find as much gasoline as they could from cars that were still around that had been destroyed, and poured gasoline all over their bodies and burned their bodies. So the Soviets couldn't take their bodies and parade them through the streets of Moscow like trophies. They wanted them cremated. Okay? Later on, it was uncovered, information was uncovered that the Russians did in fact find what was left of their bodies, their charred remains. There wasn't much left. They actually used Hitler's dentist to look at his teeth. His dentist was able to identify from x-rays and things, was able to look at dental work he had done on Hitler. Yeah, that's him. And so what did remain of Hitler was destroyed to prevent, wherever his ashes were spread from becoming a place of pilgrimage. In a museum, the Soviet National Museum, now the Russian, I call it Soviet because I grew up in the Cold War, just dated myself. In Russia, the National Museum, there's a skull fragment with a hole through it, which is where Hitler shot himself. You can actually see that skull fragment in the museum in Russia today. The Goebbels family did the same thing. Dr. Goebbels had 5 children. They were all down in the Fuhrer bunker. And Magda Goebbels, who was called the Right Mother, told her children that they were going to be taking sleeping pills to help them sleep. So she gave them all sleeping medicine and put them to sleep, and then put cyanide capsules in each of their little mouths and made them bite down on them and kill. She killed each one of her children, little kids. And then she and Dr. Goebbels went up into the courtyard, gave the Nazi salute, shot one another, then had their bodies burned. So I'll tell you a story here in just a second. Let me get through this, and I'll tell you guys a really neat story. So anyway, the Soviets did ultimately take the city. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide and instead of being taken prisoner. There was a second Fuhrer. There was a second Fuhrer. A lot of people don't know this. His name was Karl Dönitz. He was the Grand Admiral of the Nazi Navy. So there actually was a second Reich Fuhrer for a couple days. On May the 2nd, German generals surrendered. May the 8th, 1945 is known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. The remaining Nazi leaders signed their surrender to the Allies. When the battle ended, there were 360,000 Soviet casualties, 310,000 German casualties, and 22,000 German civilians that were killed. The war in Europe was over, but still raged on in the Pacific. So it's estimated that in addition to these casualties, it's estimated that there were over 200,000 rapes of German women by Soviet soldiers. Isn't that incredible? I mean, horrifying. Civilian casualties. The Russians had a blank check to do whatever they wanted to do to the German people. And so it was a horrifying thing for everybody, but especially the civilian population. The Russians had no mercy on the Germans because they had no mercy on them. Okay. You see here 2 down, 1 to go. There's Mussolini gone, Hitler gone, and Hirohito, the only one left standing. So after the war was over in Europe, the Allies are going to be able to take everything they've got and throw it against the Japanese in the Pacific theater. Everybody got that? Are we good? Excellent. So, an Allied victory.